Transformation of the Gunpowder Empires. All right, so here we go. And those are the two that we're going to talk about, the two I circled. This first one we're going to speak of today is the Ottoman Empire. And we're going to look at the decline of this empire right now. Notice that it extends into three continents, well, pretty much two continents. It was larger earlier. It was much more powerful earlier. But now, as we'll see, we're going to cover a lot of time in the life of this empire. And you'll see how things begin to change and how certain things seem similar within each of these empires, just as within each of these places here that had revolutions or unifying empires and things of that sort. That there are similarities between those as well. All right, so the Ottoman Empire. Okay, there. Oh, I keep those things permanently. No, I gotta fix that. Gotta fix that. Okay, erase. Erase. Okay, good to know. All right. The Ottoman Empire comprised Eastern Europe, the Middle East, Southwest Asia. Just take care of that right now. And North Africa. And you can see also other cultural areas, other sultanates and other regions that may cause threats to the east. You have the rise of the European states in the west. So the Ottoman Empire is in a very precarious spot. It was great in the beginning, just not so much now. All right. Back. By 1750, the Ottoman Empire was clearly in decline. It still controlled this region right here that I was talking about, but this is not the size, the scope, the power that it was earlier. It is definitely, it felt its better days. The Sultan and Vizier, the two essential figures of leadership in the Ottoman Empire, held absolute power. How successful the Ottoman Empire moved throughout history, maintained its power, how it was perceived, really came down to the talent, the energy, the sort of like the verve of the Sultan. So if they were weak or wishy-washy or indecisive, if they were in poor health, if they made bad choices, then the empire as a whole reflected those choices, reflected those things about them as people. Family disputes, the constant desire for things to be traditional, the constant desire for things to be the way they were, or to stay relatively status quo, made it a challenge and a struggle for the Ottomans, especially as the West begins to westernize. And as those governments begin to strengthen and they put pressure on the Ottomans, and as the Ottoman Empire, especially out in the far reaches of their empire, they too begin to gain a little more local control, a little more provincial. They become more important in their area than the Sultan, and those also aid into pulling this apart. These are centrifugal forces, things like how a centrifuge separates things. Centrifugal forces in societies or in nations are things that pull them apart. And the sheer physical size of the Ottoman Empire, as well as the rise of local governors, can pull it apart. The very military, the very group of people that were able to take over Constantinople and defeat that group of people, their military began to lack and to fall behind. They did not keep up with the West and its industrialization, especially when you get, more into the 1800s. The same thing happens to other gunpowder empires who refuse to westernize, modernize, things of that sort. China suffers this fate because they refuse to totally embrace what's out there because they've always felt that they were self-sufficient. Nationalism hurt the Ottoman Empire as well. If you look at this map here, there are various regions, and each of those regions begins to take on sort of the characteristics of the people living within them. So, you have the Greeks and the Bulgars and the Turks and the Syrians, and all these different people begin to exert pressure on the Ottoman Empire because they're starting to see themselves as this collective, not this collective. So what the Ottomans are going to have to do, if they're going to want to keep this empire alive, maybe help it grow, is figure out a way to sort of instill that nationalist sense that we're all Ottomans. Sort of like what we have to do right now in America is get people to understand that, yeah, there are different states and there are different regions and we have different ways of looking at the world, but ostensibly it matters more that we're all Americans and that, we're all in this together. Anyway, um, remember too, at any time, because this is recorded, if you need to stop, take a break, take your notes, that's great. I also was thinking, and I realize now maybe I should have said this sooner, that depending on how your notebooks are set up, like if you use a binder or a loose leaf, or if you type your notes, you could easily like create a page and add this after the first time we spoke of the Gunpowder Empires and kind of have them both together for a sort of a beginning and an end for continuity pieces and change pieces, or just to have them, relatively close to each other in your notes. If you're not one of those people and your notebook has to be the way it's been going the whole time, that's cool. I get it. Notes are personal. You could always get tabs, like sticky tabs, and do like a certain color for each sort of unit or each sort of concept. And that way you could find them close to each other. Just a thought. In 1839, so we've skipped ahead a bit, the Ottoman Empire begins a series of Western-style reforms called the Tanzimat, meaning reorganization. Again, this is what I was talking about. If you're going to keep those other cultures to feel a part of the Ottoman Empire, you're going to have to figure out some way to unite them all culturally, socially. Something's going to have to pull them together. All right. On this political cartoon, the female figure in this cartoon represents Turkey, and the chains being cut off are sort of the group's thought that they need to move forward and unshackle themselves from the past, unshackle themselves from what, or not, sorry, I meant Turkey, unshackle themselves from the Ottoman Empire of the old. That if we're going to survive, we have to change. They even go as far as to um, even go as far as to up here, the French flag is the up here in Turkish and in French is the quote "Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité." So I mean, they go so far as to borrow from the French. There it is, right there. Okay, from the French Revolution. Again, Enlightenment ideas make their way to various parts of the world. The reforms included Western schools, they included Western customs, they included the replacement of Sharia with Napoleonic Code, which is a big deal considering it's a Muslim state. Railroads, the military are updated. So a lot of Western stuff and a lot of reform stuff begin working their way into Turkish life. And part of this too is pragmatic. If we bring these changes in and we give people choices and we give them opportunities that heretofore they haven't had, then maybe we can get them to buy into this, and we can maintain our power if we can be purely selfish about it, and we can maintain the Ottoman Empire, but maybe make people's lives a little better too. I don't know, but definitely to keep the empire together. And then these are some of the various reforms they went through. These are the Enlightenment inspired reforms, and they pretty much are like protection of life, honor, and property. They reorganized civil and criminal codes. Slavery and the slave trade are both abolished. Any religious person is a citizen of the empire, which, remember, for a while it was the Ottomans, and then you had another role if you were not an Ottoman. Private sector publishing houses and printing firms. So now it's not a state-run newspaper. You can have different kind of news. You can have different opinions in the news, perhaps. Homosexuality was decriminalized. That's a huge thing in the Muslim world. Regardless of your ethnic makeup, regardless of your religion, you were granted citizenship. And again, so those are some really important changes from Those were inspired by the Enlightenment. Some other changes, these are political reforms. Post offices are established, the first parliaments. Now there's a lawmaking body. The army gets reorganized. The idea of a national anthem and an Ottoman flag. Again, ideas that evoke um, nationalism, and these are centripetal forces. These are things that you use to keep people together, to unite people. Healthcare ministry, the abolition of that Devonshire system in the military, that conscription of kids and others is gone away with. And I'm sorry you can't really see this. They have a school of political sciences open to help train policymakers and help people learn how to be politicians and make decisions. Whoops. Education reforms. They create a council of education, a ministry of education, so an office to help with the education of their people. First, they have universities, academy of sciences, and then following in the Chinese model and others, the civil service schools to teach the citizens of their country how to work for the government, how to do things to help assist in work being done for the government. And then economic reforms, paper money, they have the first steam-powered commuter ferries, a telegraph network, railroads, guilds are replaced with factories. There's a central bank and a school of economic sciences to study economic theory to, again, help yourself grow. So they put physical things in place. They put educational things in place. And, I don't know the time frame. There's no years here. But you have to think that this is an awful lot of change right away. And as we've seen historically, this kind of change, this rapid, tends to, lead to people getting afraid. The reforms gave equality to non-Muslims, and it did allow importation of foreign goods, which, again, putting two and two together means that for the longest time, Ottoman goods were Ottoman goods, I guess. But it only slowed the decline. These changes didn't end it. Okay, but they were a noble attempt, I guess. They were an honest attempt, but there were certain things about these changes and certain things about these people. Remember, change, and there are lots of factors that go into how successful these places are, how successful the people are, how willing they are to accept these changes, and a lot of the Islamic faith is going to make this a challenge. All right. In 1853 to 1856, the Crimean War takes place, and it takes place right here in the Crimean Peninsula. It was a war that Russia fought with the Ottomans, and then the French and the British came and helped the Ottomans. It was I tried watching that documentary on the Ottoman Empire. It was either on when I had Amazon Prime, or it's on Netflix. So if I ever find it, I'll try and finish it again. It's kind of tough because it's 1850s stock footage and things. The most important thing I remember about the Crimean War is the stage where the charge of the Light Brigade takes place. It's that battle, that charge of that group. It takes place during the Crimean War, and for what it's worth, it's also used in. It's also a point of reference in an Iron Maiden song. All right. Anyway, but what this war points out to the French and to the British, especially who go to help them, is just how weak the Ottoman Empire had become. So it's very eye-opening to the Europeans about the state of this empire, both from a standpoint of protection. Can they be counted on as an ally, or maybe we can go in and start picking some stuff off ourselves? Because remember, that's 1835, 1853, so they're well into their new imperialism. So maybe they can start making inroads into getting pieces of this too. Who knows? Well, we'll find out later. The Ottomans, with the help of the British and French, keep the Russians from the Black Sea, which is what they wanted. But they would not have been able to do it had the French and the English not helped them out. The empire itself has to be bailed out, and they almost file for bankruptcy, declare bankruptcy. That's how ineffective the reforms were and how the economy wasn't bolstered by all the reforms going in. And also remember, war is expensive. This is 20 years after the war. We don't know how the leaders have been, but these reforms aren't working, obviously. Sultan Abdul Aziz is a conservative. He rejected these reforms and fear that the sultans were getting too powerful led to coups. Like, these reforms were being thrown out by the sultans, and then they're saying, look at what I'm doing. And there's this fear that they're going to have too much power, almost in like a Caesarish kind of way, which led to a coup. And there are a number of coups in history when it is felt that leadership is gaining too much power. Another sultan, Sultan Abdul Hamid II, had 17. Well, you can't read it there. He had 13 wives and 17 children. Let me get me out of the way. There you go. Fun fact: 13 wives, 17 children. If you demanded liberal change, if you were a minority, you were massacred while he was in charge. He was the Red Sultan, I'm assuming, for blood. Conservative Sultan wanted to keep things the way they were. Remember, most people who don't like change, those people who fear that their power and their importance, whether it be economic or political or social or whatever, is threatened, is going to be lessened. And if you're going to give things to people below me, I'm not going to like it. And that just seems to be a trend that even today, that continues to exist. In 1908, the Ottoman Society for Union and Progress, the Young Turks, these are the people that are eventually going to give us Turkey. They wage a coup, and they want a much more liberal constitution to be adopted. Long live the fatherland, long live the nation, long live liberty is what that says. All right. And then here's some nice political cartoons just showing you what is going on in Turkey as we move towards the end of the 19th century. There's political instability. We've referenced coups. We've referenced changes in government. We have referenced all the failed economic reforms and westernizing reforms to keep this empire somewhat relevant, vibrant, alive. The cartoon on the left shows Austria and probably Germany, maybe Russia, pulling apart pieces of the empire. And then over there on the right, you see a doctor, two people sitting there waiting, probably France and England, for the Ottoman Empire to die. And then there's death with the handlebar mustache. He looks like the bowler hat guy from Meet the Robinsons, waiting for the sick man of Europe to die. And that's going to move us to our next gunpowder empire for tonight, the Russian Empire. Conservatism and reform. So we're going to see both things again in this gunpowder empire. We're going to see Russia try and balance being Russian and being conservative and the people, the land holding people holding on to things. We're going to come back to Peter and Catherine and look at them trying to westernize us, and then all the different czars and how they handle things and how it all ends with a guy named Lenin. All right, so attempts to modernize Russia have been going on. Reform in Russia were always met with unwillingness to accept less power. It's like I was alluding to earlier with the Ottomans. People in power, people with money, don't like giving up power or money. It's typically a rule. It's not a hard, fast rule, but it seems to be one of those things where to give all that up is just something that doesn't seem like something to do, something you want to do. So any kind of reform in Russia was met with hesitancy because it meant giving stuff up. All right, here's our friend Peter the Great. We've known him before, so way back in 1750, right before the revolutions start, during the Enlightenment period, Peter's like, we need to look west. We need to look over here, and not so much over here for what we need to do. And so Peter does that, and he takes Russia west. He tries to modernize Russia. Catherine also embraces westernization. She also embraces the Enlightenment. Remember, she was pen pals with Voltaire. But as you can see, she is the queen. She is in charge. Despot means you're in charge and not necessarily the nicest person in the world, but she also recognized that liberal reforms in Russia would help her throne, help her reign, and help her people, unless you're a serf. Mm. Speaking of serfs, or Cossacks, um, not Evgeny, Emelian Pugachev, Pugachev, Pugachev. Who's that guy, you ask? Well, I'll show you. He was a Cossack. Remember, they were the people out from the steppes in the rural parts of Russia, excellent horsemen. Um, he demanded land redistribution. He demanded lower taxes. He demanded the draft be ended. He led a serf uprising against the reign of Catherine. Um, Now, it's worth knowing here in this quote that what he's saying is that, yes, this is what we want, but if you do not follow me, I will punish you just as harshly. If you're going to serve with me, great, we can do this together. If you're not going to be committed to it, then I'm going to have a problem with you too. All right. Catherine crushes the rebellion, and that little uprising sort of marks the beginning of the end, or the end of any kind of reform movement in Russia for a while. It was okay to give reforms out if the people were okay with them, if they led to little changes, if they didn't lead to uprisings, and here we have one. So no, we're not going to do this anymore. So she recommits herself to being an absolute ruler. I shall be an autocrat. That's my trade, and the good Lord will forgive me. That's his. That's a cool quote. All right. So what she does is she seeks territorial expansion, and all that stuff in pink is all the land that Russia acquires under the rule of Catherine the Great. So they get Finland in Europe and other parts of Europe, and they get over there in the Caucasus region, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, those places. They get part of Central Asia, some more stans, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, those places. And over there on the north coast, the southeastern part of Russia, the northeastern part of China, and that area will be contested with Russia and the Japanese a little later. So she helps Russia grow. She gets that warm water port that Peter couldn't. But she passes. And Tsar Alexander I is the Tsar of Russia during the time of the Napoleonic reign and the Napoleonic Wars. He joins the Holy Alliance in 1815, that group that, after the defeat of Napoleon, wants to return Europe back to a more conservative, monarchical type of existence. Slow down, stop the reforms, remind the peasant and the middle class who's actually in charge, that kind of thing. So he follows that lead, which is, he is following European leads. So he's keeping Russia in arm's length of Europe. But the reforms of the Enlightenment, the reforms undertaken by Peter, and then to a greater extent by Catherine, even though she stopped them, he almost, it's historically impossible to take a step backward. But the focus is more of a shift and a return to the truly autocratic leader. Liberty should be confined within limits. Basically, there should only be as much freedom and as much liberty. Um, uh, as much freedom and as much liberty as can be had while still maintaining order. So that's sort of the plan here. So that's what he does. He joins that Holy Alliance. And again, the question here for causation, like, why do rulers change that? Why is it every time there's these steps forward, there's this jerk like back to the way things were? What is the underlying factor, that fear that kind of keeps them from wanting to continue forward, whether it's 1812 or 2021? All right. He died, leading to a revolt by army officers, and this was the Decembrist revolt, and they were demanding constitutional reform. Again, once ding dong, the czar is dead, and the guy who was saying no to reform is no longer there. So, while there's a break in the action, let's see if we can find somebody to reform things for us. That doesn't work. Tsar Nicholas I puts down the Decembrists. After this time, Russia becomes arguably the most conservative government in Europe because, again, it's big, it's unwielding. The boyars, the nobility of Russia want to consolidate their power, want to keep their power, and they can't have the army rising up against them either, if we're being honest. All right, Tsar Alexander I gives way to Tsar Nicholas I, and then it gives way to me, who's in the way here. Yep, let me back up and move my mug. All right, in the early 1800s, the shift west and the looking west that Peter and Catherine embraced, this group does not. They resist the call to be a more Western-looking nation. They resist the call to industrialize, and they're just going to stay in sort of their proto-industrial selves, and they're going to stay primarily agricultural, still predominantly a feudal system. Serfdom still exists. In fact, serfdom's going to exist into the second half of the 19th century, actually. All right. God, I'm just in the way. Okay. In 1853, Tsar Nicholas saw an opportunity to defeat the Ottomans to secure access to the Mediterranean through the Turkish Straits. That was the war. That was the Crimean War that we were talking about earlier. So now you get to see it from the Russian side. There they are, the Bosporus Straits, the Dardanelles, two regions that are pretty important back in ancient times. Now in the 19th century, they're going to be important in the 20th century. The what's it called? The Caucasus, the southern region, the southwestern region of the Soviet Union, the Caucasus were sought after by Hitler and others because of the fuel, the oil there. So, I mean, Russia has resources. If they could, get stable, progressive leadership, they could really, really be an economic force. The Crimean War, France and Britain opposed Russian expansion. They helped the Ottomans defeat Russia, which is what they wanted all along. It wasn't so much that the French and the British were trying to help the Ottomans. It was really to stick it to Russia, because if Russia is going to be a threat in the European continent, then they need to stop them because they're large. And again, there has to be the recognition and the realization that if they got their act together, then they could pose a really big threat. Again, this quote here: "This war was not fought for the sake of the Ottoman Empire. This war was fought for the sake of Europe. This war was fought to keep the powers in Europe where they were, to keep them in England and keep them in France, because it's 1853, so Germany doesn't exist yet. Italy's new and not quite figured themselves out yet, but France and Britain want to maintain status quo." Russia's humiliating defeat forced Tsar Alexander II. So basically, after all these defeats, after the last two czars, Alexander II realizes, okay, we cannot do this. This was embarrassing. We have the population, we have the resources. We need to get our act together. So the great reforms begin under Tsar Alexander II. Under his rule, no, I don't need to be bigger. Under his rule, Alexander II issued the Emancipation Edict, which freed all the serfs. In 1861, the year the American Civil War started, serfs are given their freedom in Russia. They're not given any land, so basically they go from serfs to straight up peasants, and now they're free to go wherever they want to go, but they don't have any land or any place to call their own. And this just shows you where the serfs are in Russia by percentage. And again, in the areas where most of the people live is where you find most of the serfs. So that really shouldn't be surprising. Most of Russia's population is heavily, heavily skewed to the western part of the country for obvious reasons. River access, soil, climate. I mean, for as cold as Russia is, imagine there's no way it lives in Siberia, say. So And it's also important to note, and this is kind of a telling thing, he abolishes serfdom because basically what he's saying here is, look, if you're going to do something like this, like abolish serfdom or end slavery or some sort of political reform, um, it is best to do it from the top. So it is best that the czar issue the freedom. That way he can be seen in a way to gain more support from the people he's freed, but also because if you allow it to come from below, it can be far detrimental for the country and far more detrimental for the czar or for the ruler himself. So even if you don't necessarily believe it's an awesome thing to do, it is better to do it um, from the top down. Under Alexander, he actually introduced a system of local and regional self-government. Basically, what he's allowing is that local areas to kind of govern themselves, to be little provincial areas, kind of like what we saw in the Ottoman Empire, um, so that they can kind of get a better handle on their people, and they can help defer the cost of rule. Um, the Zemstvos consisted of this group of people: nobles, landowners, clergy, wealthy townspeople. 74% of this political body were made up of nobles, even though the nobles only made up about 1% of the population. Again, those with tend to make all the decisions for those without, even though there's more of those without or with less than. The Zemstvos provide an opportunity for discussion, so they could sit and come together and think about changes, think about what needed to be done. But it didn't give them an avenue to talk directly to the czar or to develop any kind of policies to change Russia holistically. Okay, so it does allow places to discuss things, but it doesn't allow any avenue for them to go any further. The assassination of Alexander II ends Russia's brief period of reform. There always seems to be something going on when there's reform, then something bad happens, an uprising, a revolt, an assassination, and that kind of puts the brakes on reform. It's almost like Russia's born under a bad cloud. And then this is just someone talking about the explosion, that His Majesty's legs were shattered, and then he just pretty much bled out. The explosion was huge. Tsars Alexander III, 1881 to 1894, and Nicholas II, the one everybody knows, were more committed to the way things were, to typical autocratic rule. I'm in charge, you're not. Do as I say. This is the way it is. I'm the czar. All hail me. They do a couple of good things, like they do start to try to industrialize. I think they realize at some point we have to take advantage of all this, and they do. They build the Trans-Siberian Railroad, which is a major, major feat. They begin to expand their coal and steel production because they have the coal, they have the ore, and now they have the railroad to get the goods across this vast, like I think 8 time zone country. I can only imagine how many people were buried along that railroad during its construction. The industrialization, was a good thing, but there was no other reforms to go along with it. No political reforms as far as voting or rights or things like that. Excuse me. Okay, dog's gone. Anyway, these lack of reforms just don't like give the industrialization any kind of momentum, any kind of big change for a larger piece of the Russian population. So what you start getting then are various other movements coming up within Russia itself to try and change the way things are, because it's just not, Russia's not going to go anywhere if the typical political uh, status quo is maintained. And again, this is just them talking about that altogether. The present movement for freedom is not of new birth. Its roots are embedded in centuries of history. So what they're saying is that if Russia is going to evolve and if Russia is going to talk about freedom, it's not enough just to say freedom. It has to start from the government, and the government has to want this to occur. It must want the state to succeed. It must want the people to be better off. If the government is not committed to it, then it's just words, and ultimately Russia will fall apart. There's the constitutional Democrats, or the cadets. They wanted a constitutional monarchy. So this is one change going from the autocratic ruler to still being a czar, but with a legislative body, a constitutional, a parliamentary type body there to kind of quell his power. Um, so again, they don't want to destroy with anarchy. They just want to tweak it. Okay. The other group during this time period were the Social Democrats, and they were working for economic and political revolution. And they split into two groups: the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. So within this group, you had different ways of looking at change and how change should occur. The Mensheviks, these people right here, favored gradual socialist reform, gradual change, small incremental change that can be easily explained, I guess, and probably more easily accepted than revolutionary change. And again, Menshevik equals minority. The other group, I don't want to hide that man's face. He's in this picture for a reason. Oh my gosh, he looks like Zemo. Anyway, the other group are the Bolsheviks. Yay, Bolsheviks, led by this guy, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. They favored a revolution, a straight up communist revolution with a small elite group of revolutionaries. Again, if you look at communism, the people in charge are the government, and then everybody else is all the same. So there's one group of people. There's a ruling group, and then everyone else is the same. They, I'm assuming, saw themselves as the ruling group. They would be the ones to make the decisions, et cetera, et cetera. So, and the Bolsheviks are the majority, and that, my friend, is where we're going to stop. So we've talked about two groups. We've seen how they have tried to reform and tried to stay solvent. Russia, ironic and interestingly enough, is probably a little healthier than the Ottomans at the turn of the 20th century. It's all going to change. The Bolsheviks, especially, are going to get a lot of help in their calling, because of the First World War and how Tsar Nicholas handles that war and things going on. So tomorrow in class, we're going to talk about what happens to the Qing dynasty. Maybe a little bit with the Mughals, but definitely the Qing dynasty. And then after that, I'll do a migration video at night. And then Thursday, we should start the First World War, or maybe I'll just do the migration Thursday and start the First World War Friday, since I have pushed the test back from Friday to Monday, the Friday to Monday window. Anyway, that's the demise or the change or the struggles of the gunpowder empires. I hope it makes sense. If you have any questions, please drop them below. It'd be kind of cool. And I will see all of you tomorrow. Thanks, everybody.